joined once again by Dave Dulio. He is a professor of political science at Oakland University and the director for its Center for Civic Engagement. And he joins us now once again on the MegaCast. Dave, thanks for being with us today.
Good morning, Tyler. Thanks for having me.
Good morning. So let's start off with the Center for Civic Engagement, because the programming there is back. It's a really great concept you have over there. You talk about political topics, you talk about topics that affect our communities, but also, and more importantly, especially in the times that we're in now, politically especially, open that dialogue, a civil dialogue among people where they can have their opinions heard, they can share ideas and maybe find some common ground on these issues, and you bring in experts as well that can help to provide more context and more information than maybe you are able to provide or other professors at Oakland University are able to provide, because these experts have a greater level of expertise in those particular areas. A really interesting one that's coming up soon, actually Thursday night at 7 o'clock, is entitled The Changing Landscape of College Athletics, and it is a virtual panel discussion on how college athletics are already changing or will continue to change in the future as the NCAA and other organizations have opened up their previous restrictions on the sale and the advertising of players and their athletes and their name, image, and likeness. This is a really packed lineup. Guests include Jay Billis from ESPN, Oakland University men's basketball coach Greg Campe, 97.1 The Ticket afternoon drive co-host Rico Beard will also be the moderator of that. Can you tell us a little bit about what they will be speaking about on this very complicated topic that's still really in its infancy of being enacted across the NCAA?
Yeah, Tyler, you hit on a number of really good points there. You know, the one of the things that I really like about the direction we're headed with the center is to show folks on campus and off campus that civic engagement really reaches every corner of campus. And as you know, we've talked about things we've done at the center previously that have partnered with, say, the School of Business or the Department of Sociology or the Department of Communications or the School of Nursing, right? Well, this time we're reaching across campus to athletics. And, you know, there is this connection of civic engagement here because it's political, and not in a partisan sense, but in a governmental sense. And here in Michigan last year, we had bills introduced in the House and Senate, State House and State Senate, that were eventually signed by the governor that permit student athletes now to profit from the use of their name, image, and likeness. And also included on the panel that you described is State Representative Joe Tate.
Yes. One
of the sponsors, co-sponsors of that legislation. And one of the things about Rep. Tate that is, in addition to being a state rep and one of the co-sponsors of this legislation, he played football at MSU. And so he knows what it was like under the old regime, right? Where you weren't able, or student athletes weren't able to do that sort of thing. And so we'll talk to him about the legislation. We'll talk to some of our student athletes about how they're navigating the changing landscape of college athletics. And it goes beyond the name, image, and likeness issue to the transfer portal. There are Supreme Court decisions that are impacting student athletes. So we're going to talk about all of that with, as you say, a packed panel of experts.
Yeah, and all this really circles back to a decades-long issue with the NCAA, and a really long-time issue. It's been a debate for a number of years without a whole lot of action taken on it, other than the antitrust lawsuit, of course, famously O'Bannon versus the NCAA, that was ultimately decided in 2014, which was brought up by former UCLA basketball player and later NBA basketball player Ed O'Bannon. And this is not entirely a political issue that people would think. People wouldn't typically think of this as being a major political issue, but it is, because it affects people's representation in their communities, on pillars of their communities, such as universities, and even within those universities, their athletics programs that are often what attracts a lot of people to either visit or patronize the campus, to donate to the university, or even in some cases to go to the university, whether it be student athletes or not. And that representation also includes a massive profit for a lot of these universities, particularly those blue blood programs in major sports like football and in basketball and others. And with all the discussion we've had over the past year and a half, 2 years about representation, particularly for people in Black, Indigenous, and people and person of color populations and BIPOC populations that make up a large sum of our student athletes, this becomes a very important topic, especially considering that the amount of money that has been generated through these athletic programs over a number of years that these players have not seen a dime of.
Right, and I'll take it even a step further and say that it's a political or civic issue. And let me I should have said this before, but this was bipartisan legislation that was passed in the State House and State Senate and then signed by Governor Whitmer last year. We shouldn't forget that. This is a great example of in time where, as we've talked about before, where we don't see examples like this very often, but a great example of a Democrat and Republican coming together to write legislation that it advances through the legislative process. But I'll take it beyond political and civics and say it's about rights, right? The ability of a student athlete to control the use of his or her own name, image, and likeness. We're seeing sort of more freedom for student athletes with transfer portal and other aspects of maybe being able to get more benefits from a college or university that, as you say, many of them make millions of dollars and benefit from these student athletes taking the field or taking the court.
Yeah, and it also benefits those athletes that maybe are not in those sports of heavy spotlight, but are athletes on their campus. If you're able to be an MSU athlete, you are someone that has a lot of attention garnered toward you in East Lansing. Whether you're playing in a major sport that garners a lot of attention, like the football team or the basketball team, but if you're a volleyball player there, if you're a swimmer there, if you are on the rowing team there, you're able to get those sponsorships where local businesses benefit from having that representation and that association in one way or another with the athletics program at Michigan State University, albeit not a direct representation of that because it's through these individual players and athletes themselves. But it provides benefits to the community, and it provides benefits to a lot of these athletes down the line, not only those in the more profitable, so to speak, sports like basketball or football at the NCAA level, but those that are playing other sports as well that have the similar struggles of being a full-time student athlete as they do in these other high-profit sports, but to get even less representation and are even less thought of in these situations when we're talking about the representation of these athletes and what they benefit from in terms of their athletic programs.
Sure, it really, it opens it up to for lack of a better term, a capitalist market, right? Where anybody can go out and profit from a sponsorship deal. If they can get it, they can benefit from it. And we're seeing some unique ones that are popping up. I've read about some players on some football teams that are sponsored by barbecue restaurants, right? And they get paid in barbecue, right? Well, that's not a bad deal for those for those folks, right? There's an interesting one at MSU, right, with the donor who is going to sponsor every member of the football team and basketball team. Yeah. And that's an interesting one too, because it gets at the fact that a lot of this is yet to be ironed out, and we're not really sure how all of this is gonna shake out. There's gonna have to be adaptation. There's gonna have to be change, really from athletics departments. And questions about equity will come in. You mentioned the ability of swimmers and divers and golfers and soccer players to get into that capitalist market. But if some student athletes are highlighted more than others, does that create a tiered system? And I think athletics departments are going to have to figure that out, right? This is kind of a new world of college athletics, and that's what we're going to try to. We're not going to solve anything tomorrow evening when we talk about this, but we're going to try to dig into some of those questions and problems that might come up, and just talk about it and see where everybody is.
Yeah, and if you're a sports aficionado, if you're an expert in this area, you probably have a decent idea about what's going on already, and you probably understand it pretty well in the context of how it does impact our communities politically. But if you're not, and you're just either a casual sports fan or you're not a sports fan at all, this is an important issue that's going to continue to be impactful in our college communities for years to come into the distant future. And so getting that context is really important. We're joined by Dave Dulio. He's a professor of political science at Oakland University and the director of its Center for Civic Engagement that will hold that the changing landscape of college athletes virtual panel discussion. Again, that is Thursday night at 7:00 p.m. But Dave, we have a lot of other important things to be talking about at the state level. The state budget, of course, recently was signed into law by Governor Whitmer. It highlights a lot of investment in a variety of other different programs, such as child care, especially both providing more affordable child care and incentives to those that are working in the industry or would be potentially working in the industry to provide greater care, and it's also providing more of an emphasis on a number of other issues we've talked about over the past year, such as environmental issues, such as PFAS, improving infrastructure. This is a bill that, like any other budget, this budget was highly debated among the two parties in Lansing, both the Republican-led legislature and the Democratic governor's office. But it really did seem that in the end, they were able to come to a compromise in a lot easier of a fashion than we normally see when it's typically in the past been very down to the wire with the threat of a shutdown.
Certainly at the federal level, no doubt, right? I do think that the last couple of years have seen the budget process go longer than it did, say, during the Snyder administration, yes, when these were usually wrapped up in the summer. And some of that's undoubtedly divided government at work, right? Where, as you mentioned, right, we've got a Democratic governor and a Republican-controlled legislature. But you make a really good point again, is that, they got it done in a compromise manner to a large degree. Now, there are certainly things that were included that the governor didn't like, and she used the line item veto power that she has to knock out some of those. And it's all part of the process.
We're joined by Dave Dulio. He's a professor of political science and the director of the Center for Civic Engagement at Oakland University. And at the federal level, you talked about negotiations on budget issues, but there's also been a really interesting dynamic there, particularly in the Democratic Party on infrastructure issues, because the Democratic Party, they have the presidency, they have the majority in the Senate, they have a slight majority in the House, and yet they're not able to seem to come together and get to the finish line on a lot of these issues, particularly the Build Back Better Act. What exactly is for those that maybe aren't familiar, is the issue there, and what are the chances that this legislation actually goes through in a timely manner?
Well, and we've passed the point of it going through in a timely manner, right? This has been
Sure.
On the table for months. What's the issue? Well, it's a number of things, right? I mean, it is on one level, it's the rules of the United States Senate, where Democrats are going to use a process called budget reconciliation to get this through, maybe. With only 51 votes rather than the 60 votes that would normally take to move controversial legislation through that chamber. And I say they may move it through because Democrats aren't united on this. And you're seeing this play out with not only within the Democratic Party, but across chamber, right? The U.S. House has got a bit of a different position on the Build Back Better plan than the United States Senate does. The different senators like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema have got their priorities, where the progressive wing of the party that's really more powerful, I would say, in the House, has got its priorities. But then, of course, you've got Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in the U.S. Senate. So it's really this mix of positions and priorities that these different wings of the party are trying to figure out. And, it all is going to depend on if the Democratic Party can compromise within its own caucus, really, between the progressive wing and the moderates who've got some real power here, because the majorities, as you mentioned, are so thin.
And there's also been a lot of discussion, once again, at the federal level, in regard financially, about reaching the debt ceiling. And in the past, this has been something that's been debated, and it's been used kind of as a political. The debate has been used kind of as a political weapon, depending on the party that is in the presidency, and if their opposition party is in any majority in the House or in the Senate. In this case, the president and the Democratic Party are insistent on raising the debt ceiling and to be able to make sure they don't default on the country's loans. The Republicans seem to be, particularly Senator Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, tends to be or has been trending as of late on we don't want to negotiate on that, which we know he does. We know that they do. We know that they don't want the country to default on their loans, but they're using this as a political tool. What ultimately is the goal here? Where is the finish line for the Republicans in being more resistant this time around to raising the debt ceiling, when in the past it's been an issue, but it's been usually resolved pretty quickly because both parties want the same thing. Let's not default on our country's loans.
Right. I think that one of the things we're seeing play out is the heightened use of this process of budget reconciliation. Democrats are going to use it, as we said, to potentially push through this Build Back Better plan, which we should note is undefined at this point, right? Because there's these negotiations going back and forth between the White House, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema on one side, and the progressive wing of the party on the other side. There's no final legislative text yet for us to even look at, but but they're going to use this budget reconciliation process. That is what the Republicans want to force Democrats to use to raise the debt limit moving forward. And for weeks and weeks, Democrats had said that they didn't have enough time because the reconciliation process can really drag out because of the way that it moves through the U.S. Senate and the House, for that matter. It can take a long time. Not necessarily will take a long time, but it can. So in the last couple of weeks, we saw the Republicans relent a little bit and say, okay, we'll vote to raise the debt limit here, or we'll let you bring the debt limit bill to the floor of the Senate for a vote. But only for a couple of months, which now gives Democrats plenty of time, says Leader McConnell, to use that reconciliation process to raise the debt limit much farther out into the future. And the real difference between now and previous attempts and successful attempts to raise the debt limit is, the folks in the minority party didn't stand in the way of bringing it up, right, through a filibuster. That's what Republicans have done this time until they relented previously. But there has been a pretty partisan split vote when that has come up in the past, where the majority party, whoever's in the majority party, votes for it, those in the majority party vote against it, just so that they're not on record as raising the debt limit more than they have to be.
We're joined by Dave Dulio, professor of political science and director of the Center for Civic Engagement at Oakland University. And Dave, in terms of the Democratic Party and their own divisions, it's been mostly noted among Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, who are from West Virginia and Arizona, respectively, and their reluctance to follow along with party lines, particularly when it comes to the Build Back Better Act. Given that there is a majority for the Democratic Party right now, given that Joe Biden's presidency is still in its first year, in its infancy here, and knowing that the 2022 election is going to be heavily impacted by the first year and a half to 2 years of the Biden presidency and of this majority. What are the concerns within the Democratic Party right now, or at least even particularly with Joe Manchin and with Kyrsten Sinema and others that are in their same camp on the Democratic side on Capitol Hill? What are their thoughts on how this may impact the 2022 election? Because of course they want their party to remain in power, but these actions and not being able to pass this legislation through, slowing down the processes of some of the work that the Biden administration would want to do, may very well cost them some critical elections in 2022. What is the thought process here?
Well, I think there are competing thoughts, right? I mean, because you could look at this a couple of different ways and several different ways. Actually, one of those ways is to look at, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, but focus on Manchin because he's been around a longer and he's got more of a track record on this sort of thing, right? He just doesn't support some of the stuff that's in the progressive plan. He comes from West Virginia. That's a state that Donald Trump won by 40 points in 2020, right? That is a conservative state. It's a Republican state, even though Manchin's a Democrat. But he's a conservative Democrat, which are, that is a disappearing breed these days. And he's just not going to vote for stuff that he doesn't want. And there seem to be plenty of conflicts now between that progressive wing and where Manchin is. And if they're going to get something done, somebody's going to have to give, and they're both going to probably have to give, and we'll see if they can do that. But to your question about 2022, right, there are competing problems right now with the Democrats, right, where if those on the sort of more centrist, moderate side of the Democratic spectrum, they are concerned that if a far left progressive bill gets pushed through, that they will lose independent and moderate voters, and that they will then vote for Republican candidates in House and Senate races in 2022. The progressives are concerned that if the plan isn't as progressive as they want it to be, many on the party's left base will stay home. Not that they'll vote for Republicans, but that they will just not participate in 2022, therefore being almost as big of a problem at the ballot box as a Democrat who crosses over and votes for a Republican. So this is, on some level, I'm not going to say that the debate that's happening and the negotiations that are happening are about 2022. I think that they are really genuinely trying to pass policy at this point. But we'd be kidding ourselves if we didn't think that it had an impact or potential impact on the outcome of Election Day that's going to happen in about a year.
We're joined by Dave Dulio, professor of political science and director of the Center for Civic Engagement at Oakland University, that will be holding a panel virtually on Thursday night at 7 o'clock entitled The Changing Landscape of College Athletics. Dave, before we let you go today, where can people find that link and gain access to that virtual panel?
Sure, thanks, Tyler. They can go to oakland.edu. There's a story on the main OU webpage about the panel. If you don't see it right away, you can click through a couple of pages, or you can go right to oakland.edu/poli-sci/CCE to get to the Center for Civic Engagement website. But oakland.edu will get you there too.
Well, Dave, we appreciate it. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you.